Hola, bienvenidos, bienvenidas. Para la interpretación en español, por favor marca el 844-855-4444. Otra vez, 844-855-4444. Y el código de acceso es 198-088. 198-088. Te va a tomar probablemente tratar un par de veces, pero sigue intentando y vas a poder entrar en la línea. Gracias.
Welcome, 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 community, family, comrades, those who are joining us from all over the world, all over the globe. For Spanish interpretation, please do call in 1-844-855-4444. And the access pin is 198088. Again, 1-844-855-4444. Access pin 198088. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining and continuing to join. Welcome to the Rising Majority Teach-In, Disrupting Borders and Binaries, the Global and Gendered Impacts of COVID-19 on Women of Color. We are truly honored and grateful to be with you this evening from all over the map. The Rising Majority, which is a coalition of organizations and movements across sectors committed to building a powerful and more unified left that's committed to a radical democracy that is anti-racist, that is anti-capitalist, that is anti-patriarchal, a left that is committed to a transformative vision and structural change that is, of course, both anti-racist and anti-capitalist, rooted in a number of visions and principles and values that you can find by searching at therisingmajority.com. Please, to follow this conversation, use the hashtag #RisingMajority, text majority to 90975 for updates, and of course, sign up with us to learn more about what we'll be doing in this work and the next teach-in beyond and beyond and beyond this moment. We organize this teach-in because we understand the current and potential gendered dimensions of COVID-19, how this pandemic truly highlights the ways in which women and girls and other not marginalized peoples are more likely to suffer from this pandemic in catastrophic and often unimaginable ways. This moment exposes why we need bold and tactful vision, while also fighting for what people and communities everywhere need right now and in this moment. We need both relief and long-standing solutions. Most hardships, crises, wars, famines, economic downturns, those affect women and girls more than any other individual or community or population. There's reason for that, right? It's of course the structural inequalities. It's the disparities that were existing before this pandemic that are now exposing the cracks in the system we actively fight against as community and comrades and activists every day. Women do the majority of this world's work, do the majority of this country's work, though all the while they earn a very small fraction of the world's salaries, and they own even less of the world's properties. Women and girls have access to less resources, fall victim to violences, whether it's domestic violence, mass rapes, rape inside of war. We know that domestic and sexual violences across the full spectrum of violence spike in the midst of pandemics, in the midst of crises, in the midst of catastrophes like we're facing now. There's no doubt that we're living inside of an incredibly challenging moment, and that's not even really the word that captures it. But this moment also exposes to us that there's great transformative possibility inside of the crisis. And so for us to lift up the bold and intentional demands that could shape this world that our communities have been making, the mandates that we've set forth inside of our organizations, in order to really leverage this moment of collective power, the Rising Majority is calling for a coherence of movements, engaging organizations and individuals in strategies that are, of course, crucial to deepening solidarity, but also building us up in numbers and in power. So this is not only a conversation about the consequences of COVID, but truly a discussion, which I'm so excited to facilitate and move us through, on what is blooming truly in the hands of community, on what is being built and molded, on what structures and restructuring we can do as a community and a collective, what new songs are filling the mouths of mothers and women and children, and how we are realigning power within our communities in these moments, how we are cultivating and building power across borders and across binaries, and even disrupting those borders and binaries in this moment. And so I'm so excited for this program tonight, because we have with us some of the most incredible organizers, advocates, activist leaders of our time. We are joined by Gail Lewis of the Organization of Women of African and Asian Descent, one of the founding members. The incredible and incomparable M. Adams of Freedom, Inc. I'm joined by Thenmozhi Soundarararajan of Equality Labs, Rose Berry of Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, and Ana Orozco of Grassroots Global Justice. And I'm so excited also to have Raquel Willis with us from Out Magazine and Transgender Law Center. Before starting, I really would like to invite people to sign up again for updates, to follow hashtag The Rising Majority, to text majority at 90975, and follow this discussion online using the hashtag, following us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Again, welcome to the panelists who will be really in a roundtable discussion. I hope this can be a private but intimate conversation that we make public, where we share space and allow for really a spirited and authentic and raw dialogue to transpire here, as we're not able to gather with each other in person, but we're able to see each other's faces, right? And to share some of the strategies, and also to look at a landscape analysis of what's happening on the ground in our communities now. And so I'd love to just jump right in and get to business with the folks who I have on the line, and again, to hear their incredible voices. And so I want to ask each of the panelists, and we'll do this in a particular order, but what is your assessment, right, of this crisis, which we know is unprecedented at this time? What does it tell us about some of the gendered and racialized consequences of this moment? How would you frame this moment, right, of the current crisis through a feminist lens, right, that calls into question issues of gender, violence, the disproportionate impact of the pandemic on women of color? And specifically, as we get into that, I would love to ask one of our panelists, of course, to ground us in what's really been happening in the last few days, right? We've been experiencing not a rise in violence, but a rise in visibility around violence in the community, right? Various crises within the crises, right, are taking a national stage. And that includes police brutality, right, and issues that we've been fighting against. However, those particular cases there are particular cases that are often lifted up in these moments that do erase and not necessarily have us rallying around the same crises that folks of very gendered experiences face, right? So Raquel, if you could start us off and just speak to this, right? How gendered experiences of violence are happening, but there's kind of this uplifting of particular violences that are impacting particular populations, even within our community. Can you ground us in an analysis and an assessment of the current moment?
I can definitely try. I thank you, Sevonna, for opening us up. And of course, thank you to all the panelists being in this conversation, and to all the folks joining us. You know, we had a conversation just before the call, and many of us just kind of shared how heavy it's been, particularly the last few days, with kind of the virality that has happened around a few different cases. I think what has been kind of at the fore has been what happened to Ahmaud Arbery, a young Black South Georgia guy who was killed by white folks really in his neighborhood. And so a lot of people have been discussing just how devastating that was. It was also caught on video. And so I think that also plays a part in some of the virality and the sharing of Black death over and over again on social media. And also this week, there was also a situation where another young Black man was killed by police, shot by police, named Sean Reed. So again, another instance, right? And so we're seeing kind of a more complicated discussion around violence that goes beyond just what's happening by the hands of the state, but also what's happening in different communities. And I also, I think for me, in the conversations I've been having with other Black trans folks, what has been difficult for many has been kind of holding simultaneously the grief of these Black lives and also holding how certain lives are still prioritized, even in death, in terms of like who is considered important, which lives are considered the most valuable. We don't often see the same kind of rallying around the deaths of people of other gender experiences, like a Black trans woman named Nina Pop, who was found dead in Missouri under suspicious circumstances. And of course, the scores of women and feminine identified folks, gender nonconforming, non-binary folks, just across the US, across the world, who are just experiencing violence in astronomical numbers, as they always have been. And so we just thought it was important to kind of ground everyone, because I think that's been heavy on all of our hearts, just the immense amount of grief and all of these complicated feelings of how we're going to figure out the solutions to heal through these multiple layers of violence that Black folks, communities of color, marginalized folks in general are facing at all times.
Thank you so much, Raquel, just for bringing in, I think, just the really, really current and urgent moment, and how we are and how social movements, right, are grappling with how to respond to crises within crises, and then also who's being left out of that, right, conversation. As we know, Black women, trans women, cis women are also being brutalized, and sexual violence is impacting Black women, right, at high rates at the hands of the state, at the hands of police. And so state-sanctioned violence continues to have a gendered aspect that doesn't expose the same virality that we might see, and that we can hold both, right, as a community. So thank you so much. And I would love to just turn to the other panelists. What is your assessment, your current assessment of this moment, and what, where are the gendered and racialized consequences showing up for you? I'll turn it to M.
Thank you. I'm excited about this panelist. I'm excited to share, but I'm even more excited to learn. So thanks for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm really excited about all the offerings today. So to your question of what are the gendered and racialized consequences, I think we have to start with what was the gendered and racialized dimensions that got us here. So the consequences follow the catalyst for it. So we are in a pandemic, which people were falsely calling a great equalizer, because we can see across racial lines, it's not equal. And we can also observe across gendered lines, class, and a bunch of other things, that it's not at all an equalizer. It's in fact an exacerbator of existing issues. Yeah. So there are a couple of things that we can see. One, we can see the disproportionate amount of work, to your previous comments, that is on the back of women, queer, trans, intersex folks, girls, etc. Yeah. And oftentimes that work is described as care work. But I want to ground it a bit more in class and really talk about it as social reproduction work, right? So we see right now that the people who are responsible primarily and disproportionately for making society function right now are the people who are raising up people, rearing children, are the people who are caring for elderly, are the people who are frontline working to protect the lives of people who are ill or sick, are people who are preparing food, teachers, people who are running postal mail, and a bunch of other things are disproportionately women, queer, trans, and intersex folks. And that work by and large is invisibilized, ignored,
Yeah.
which has created a context where going into this COVID pandemic, there was already a disproportionate amount of wealth. There was already a disproportionate amount of power to confront the issues that they were experiencing. So now what we have is the same sect of people being, I don't want to say overburdened because it was already overburdened, but increasingly overburdened to try to lift, physically, literally, lift society out of the current COVID crisis and context that we're experiencing. We're also seeing that this is patriarchy's logic, that patriarchy, it's racial capitalism, but we really should be saying gendered racial capitalism. That racial capitalism is also deeply embedded and produced by logics of patriarchy that are based in domination. So at the same time, as we witness the theft of life, it is a theft, it is unnecessary, a theft of life for Black and Brown people under COVID is the same time where we see the earth continuing to be dominated and resources stolen and an extractive relationship with the earth, which is going to throw us in a heap of trouble with climate injustices that we are currently experiencing and will continue to experience. And then also we can see economically that corporations and those with economic power continue to act and behave extractively toward our communities, not at all focused on restoring communities, being whole with communities, or having what I call a feminist logic with communities, but instead are continuing patriarchal logics of extracted domination and doing it all under the perverted guise of being normal or being just the way nature is, or orderly way of nature.
Yeah, thank you so much, Em. I mean, for upholding, right, the way that reproductive labor holds its roots right here in the US, but also are having its global ramifications. How we're also seeing like gender racial capitalism, right, as impacting all sectors, right? Not just impacting individuals and people and even our communities, but impacting the earth itself, right? So thank you for nuancing that. Rose, I wanted to check to see if you have something to add here.
Yes, thank you. 2020, I'm still figuring out how to unmute myself on a Zoom. Thank you. First, gratitude for inviting me to be a part of this important conversation, and also gratitude to any and everyone who is attending this call tonight. I think everything that Raquel and Em so eloquently mentioned, I want to echo. Thanks, y'all. I think really what I have to add is the reality that, you know, a feminist perspective of this moment challenges us to push beyond binaries. It challenges us to push beyond borders and consider gender equity as a resistant struggle that accounts for more than just cis women, and accounts for more than just the US, and accounts for more than just the status quo or the racially capitalist socialization of womanhood. So it really pushes us outside of even the ways that we were able or allowed to be comfortable in our binaries and our understandings of the impact of these moments. This moment has also left many of us even more hungry for liberation because racial capitalism is unveiled, right? In all of the practical day-to-day ways that it harms us. So it's no longer this almighty puppeteer, you know, holding the strings above us and above society. But we're forced to sit with the fact that those of us who reside in the US are in the belly of the beast. And in all of the ways that we're actually complicit in the function and the success of racial and gendered capitalism. And I think lastly, I'll just say, you know, Black women in particular have always been last to receive care, and this moment's no different. So Black women and, you know, femmes, trans women, gender non-conforming folks, you know, we're forced to constantly have to choose between the different parts of ourselves, right? And choosing between false freedoms. So freedom of choice, freedom of speech, freedom to vote, freedom to migrate, all those things, right, that we've never actually been afforded the freedom to do. And I think this moment is like unveiling and unmasking the actual practical ways that it impacts our livelihoods. While we're simultaneously enduring the same pandemic as everyone else, we're also juggling our constant fight for actual liberation, right? So yeah, that's what I'll add for now.
Thank you for building on that initial frame and just giving us, a place to think about, as M called it, the great exacerbator, right? And you talked about unmasking and unveiling, what the conditions, right, and realities have been. So thank you for building on that. And I'll turn it to Gail, Thenmozhi, and Anna, the three of you, to just share also your preliminary kind of framing thoughts around where, this gendered issue is actually living and resonating inside of this current crisis.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to say thank you for being here, and it's a real honor and privilege to be in this global conversation. And I would echo really many of the things that has already been put on the table for us. But maybe just to add something about how the gender dynamics, the racial gender dynamics absolutely are replicated around the world, it seems to me, but have a particularity. So that in this country, for example, in Britain, I'm sitting in London, there's a way in which we've had to force onto the agenda as a part of the public conversation, the racial dynamics of this COVID-19 pandemic, in the face of a government and a public conversation where it's saying there are no racial conversations, even though it just came out today that Black people are 4 times more likely to die of COVID than white people. And yet we've had to force that. So organizations like GALDEM, which is a Black feminist organization, have been forcing this as part of the public conversation. Because in Britain, what they always want to do is pretend that racism isn't a structuring principle in this country. So they always want to go second to it, even though we're involved in exactly the same kinds of social reproduction. And I'm glad Em said that, because I think that's what's important about a feminist lens, the social reproduction that we're at the forefront of as Black and brown people who have been brought here since the end of the Second World War to do that social reproduction work in healthcare, in social care, in the provision of food and all kinds of services, and yet have been denied access to those very same services. So there's a way in which there's an echo and a complete replication, but a particularity in particular national sites. So I just really want to add that we need to pay attention to the ways in which these gendered racial capitalist logics play out around the virus in specific contexts, so that we can build alliances transnationally by paying attention to the specificities as well, because that seems to me really vital.
Thank you, Gail. Thenmozhi, please jump in. I know you can add, to this kind of transnational frame and, what it is that we should be paying attention to in this moment. What do you have for us?
Well, I think for me, the brutality of racial capitalism is really that in like easier times, like the Obama times, it was much easier to understand the kinds of stakes that it puts before us as communities of color, which is that, in many ways, like everyone has had to make a calculus between their lives and their livelihood. And I think what COVID-19 does is that it accelerates that choice where more and more people are having to see the violence of that situation. Whereas if you talk to people who have lived at the edges and at the real threshold of violence of racial capitalism, they were already in that place before COVID happened. And COVID is like, gasoline on like a fire already. Yeah. But I also think the other thing that's really important about why a feminist frame is so important in terms of dismantling this violent logic is that you know, none of our democracies were actually in a healthy position before we even got here. Like whether you're talking about the United States or Brazil or India, each of these countries had, you know, fucked up strong men, essentially, who were basically the forerunners of authoritarian fascist movements. And, you know, if it's Bolsonaro, if it's Modi, or it's Trump, you know, I always, you know, in the back of my mind, I thought, like, you know, why this moment? Why in this experience are we seeing it? And to me, I feel like, you know, when I think back down to my ancestral knowledge, there is a deep fear we have as animals when we start to see destabilization of all of our systems. And my sense is that there was a pushback on the strength of feminist practice and communities of color that really, I think, bothered the last of these bulwarks of these movements. And as we see all of the systems of our planet become challenged by climate change, I think that there was a push for people to embrace the conservative, those that were in power, as they try to hold on to whatever they can in a time of great instability. And I think that, you know, this is a time then for those of us who are thinking about radical intersectional feminist politics, that we don't run away from our politics, we have to lean into them, because this is really the ticket to our freedom. And that in many ways, I feel that, you know, as much violence as we've seen with this pandemic, as much loss of life that we've seen, you know, right now, like hopefully when all of this is over, we'll have time to grieve together and shed the tears that we've been holding back. But for now, every single act, every single care bearer that I know is focused on preserving what can be preserved and living for those that are alive so that we can fight for that future. And I don't see any other politic that can do that except a racially grounded feminist politic. And that's why we have to be here in the majority, because we are the majority.
Yeah, I think, thank you for lifting that up, and just also thinking about, you know, what in this moment does our liberation require of us, right? That each of us also continue to sit with that, and continue to sit with respectively where our ancestors were also wrestling with that over time, over administrations, over, you know, over all of the different circumstances and conditions that would have them beg the question, where in fact those politics intersected with the personal, where it intersected with the spiritual, where it intersected with survival and how we thrive, right? And so the principles, right, that the majority is rooted in right now are deeply and clearly anti-patriarchal, are anti-capitalist, are anti-racist, right, that are particularly crucial in this moment, especially as we take into account the ways in which certain stories, certain experiences, certain lived, you know, realities are not lifted up, you know, virally when, you know, when they are casualties of the war that we're constantly waging towards our liberation, right? So to be in question with that, I think will also bring us deeper and deeper. Anna, I want to have you answer this question too about the you know, the landscaping of this moment in terms of gendered consequences and then feminist responses, and then we'll move forward.
Thank you. And thank you again to the Rising Majority for extending this invitation for this very timely and necessary conversation. And I really want to echo what all the other speakers have named and add to a little bit of some of what Em was highlighting about how COVID has really put a spotlight on economic and racial and gender disparities nationally and globally, and how that false narrative of this is a great equalizer is an attempt to erase the fact that it is actually exacerbating and highlighting the huge disparities in our communities. And particularly the narrative around essential work, what is considered essential work and who is considered essential in quotation marks, but what is essential about their work? It seems like the labor is what is being highlighted as essential, but the bodies are disposable. Right. And so we're seeing now for the first time migrant agricultural work considered essential work. but these are folks who are still vastly underpaid, working under excruciating circumstances. Nursing and care work is considered essential work, and that goes in response to what's happening in the hospitals, but then also there's care work happening at home, which is considered essential, but it's also not paid work. And so it really highlights the taking for granted care work and exploitation of care work that capitalism runs on. And particularly the new norm of having to step back from our day-to-day activities of going to and from work. Some of us definitely have to, and others of us don't, but the situation at home is still requiring the care work and how that is gendered work. It is work that is associated with women, femmes, it's reproductive labor, and how, again, it is taken for granted, but considered essential and also undervalued at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thank you to each of you for addressing, right, that question that helps us take like kind of this broader landscape view. And I want to get more concrete, right, and think even more specifically about how this crisis is exacerbating issues, right? As you said, and given your work and with survivors of gender-based violence, with both sexual and domestic violence survivors, and the full, gamut and continuum and spectrum of violence that specifically women and girls and femmes of color face while sheltering in, while home with harm doers, right, and abusers, while in neighborhoods and communities across the country. What have you seen as the most pressing sort of conditions facing survivors in this moment in the US? And then, where are you landing in terms of what the responses can look like?
Thank you. So we're seeing several things. So one, with the whole safer at home, that's presuming one, that you have a home, whatever home means. And within white supremacist patriarchy, often that means if you are middle class, if you have a nuclear family, and if you are able to behave a certain way that society deems appropriate based on that structure. So already that puts Black and brown women, all Black and brown women, queer, trans, intersex, cisgender, straight, etc., disabled, all Black and brown women in a precarious condition, because by our very existence, we defy that. We defy not fitting in that mold and model. And because we are in a patriarchal society, particular forms of violence are not seen as being as important or even named as violence. So sexual violence in general is something that across all bodies and all genders is a type of violence that's seen as less significant than shootings by police and other things. And I think this is a bit of what Raquel unearthed earlier, which is particular types of violences that are targeted at women that are often done in the form of sexual violence and violence by partners, or just interpersonal violence is not even talked about in the public sphere. So what we're seeing right now is that inside of people's homes, whatever those homes are, if there is even a home, however we categorize that, there is a heightened, an increase, a spike of the number and the types of violences that are happening inside of those spheres. So the rates of sexual violence have increased, both from people's intimate partners, as well as people, and we see this as well as people who have to do sex work, or whose method of work is sex work. There's an increase of sexual violence. There's an increase in all different forms of violence, whether that's verbal, emotional, physical violence done by intimate partners. Disproportionately, those experiencing that violence are women, queer, trans, or intersex folks. There's an increase of violence against children. We've seen reports of that. We've seen New York Times do a story, and just, that's being well documented. And we're seeing this happen because it's part of patriarchy's logic to exploit the most vulnerable.
Yeah.
And we are still in a society where those seen as those that are most vulnerable, meaning with less access to systemic power, less access to institutional power, are women, queer, trans, intersex folks, and girls, that those are the ones first done harm to and first exploited. And so all inside of people's homes, we see survivors being brutalized. A friend of mine shared with me, who lives in New York City, that in the emergency room, the top 2 reasons for visits was COVID-19 related and domestic violence.
That's right.
And so we know inside of people's homes, people are not safe. And because we are inside of patriarchy, we don't have any sort of recourse or any sort of strong systems to address the violence that people are experiencing. And because when people are experiencing that violence, it's seen as an individual conflict, or it's seen as being a result of that person's bad behavior or not, fitting into whatever this motor model is, and that violence is increasing. And so I have to check the numbers. Unfortunately, they go up every day, but it is disproportionately higher as a result of COVID than it is at other times. And the other thing that we're seeing about survivors is not only are people experiencing the violence at home, but these are the same people who are most vulnerable in job sites. These are the same people who are not able to quit their jobs. These are the same people who have to take the precarious work, whether or not there's protection for them, whether or not there are masks and gloves and a host of other things. They are still forced to be out in these jobs, in these precarious and dangerous situations, because even though they are the least powerful, so to speak, they also are the ones who are still taking care of the home. So they still are having to suffer both violence by the hand of the state and institutions, as well as inside their homes right now.
Thank you, Em. Yeah, and I want to bring Raquel, into this conversation too, about where those interlocking, oppressions and circumstances and inequities, right, are disrupting communities across, right, housing, gender-based violence, healthcare, economic mobility. What are you seeing, and where are the possible interventions?
Well, I trying to make sure I'm not on mute. But I think there's a lot here that we have to unpack, especially, listening to a lot of the nuggets of brilliance that Em just dropped. I think one of the larger issues is us really grappling with what disposability looks like in our society, what disposability looks like in our communities. And so obviously we were having the conversation around which types of violences we rally around earlier, and to whom, and the ones that we don't. And I think when you consider who was disposable before this pandemic, it's only deepened that disposability for certain groups, given kind of the heightened scarcity that we're dealing with in terms of resources, in terms of access to different things like healthcare, equipment, treatment, all of these different things. And particularly as a Black trans woman, in conversation with folks in our community, in the Black trans community specifically, I think there's such a fear always that, well, we're going to be considered even more disposable when crises are heightened, because we're already considered disposable in any other time, also by folks who are the closest to us. And so it's impossible to kind of have a myopic conversation around the violence that is happening from the government or the state, the violence that is happening in the healthcare system, without kind of talking about the violence that we're already facing from those that are closest to us. There's no way to talk about this without talking about some of the things that Em raised up around dealing with violence from partners, or being queer and trans and dealing with violence from parents or caretakers who don't affirm your identity and who you are. But I will say, I think what is particular about our community is that we continue to be resilient in the face of all of that. There are folks organizing everywhere from New Orleans to Atlanta, to San Francisco, to here in New York, where I currently live. And making sure that we continue to have the resources that we need. And many of them are also raising resources and funds for people who are not specifically trans or GNC. You know, I think for many of us, we don't have the luxury to not care about folks who are outside of our specific social location. And that's kind of the urging that many of us would like to see on a larger scale, is folks seeing their humanity also in us,
yes,
in the ways that we have to see our humanity in them. The other thing I want to raise up is that I think when we also have these conversations about a feminist politic and kind of pushing the contours of it, we can't talk about this without talking about our disabled sisters and siblings, right? And, you know, I think some of the ways that people are complaining about not being able to leave the house or not being able to access different things, there's such an ignorance around the fact that many of our disabled family were not able to get the care or get access to the different things that they need as well. And so I think there's a lot of conversation right now around what ability means and how we have to consider a more holistic idea of wellness that includes what many folks, you know, everyone from Mia Mingus to Amani Barbarian to other folks of color who are disabled have been trying to raise up for many years. And then I think the last thing I will say, and I know I'm going on a little bit long, but I also think it's impossible for us to really talk about feminism in such a limited way that doesn't include the necessity for healthy expressions of masculinity. And so when we talk about the gendered experience, gender is not just something that women are experiencing, right, and experiencing violence from. It's not just something that trans people or GNC folks are dealing with. It's something that we're all dealing with together. And there's no way for us to continue to have a conversation about a more expansive feminism, especially many of us as folks of color, without talking about the need for leadership around healthy masculinities and expressions of that.
Thank you so much. You brought in so many critical pieces there that are really just threads in this conversation. And as folks are following, you know, for the last bit of this conversation, please continue to follow and contribute to the conversation through hashtag The Rising Majority and text majority to 90975. Visit therisingmajority.org to learn more about the principles and the values that are really, you know, being threaded and interweaved through this, what I think is a beautiful and organic conversation about what's necessary in this moment, not just how we respond, but also how we think about what our feminism requires of us, what our liberation requires of us, right? Like how we actually have an expanded conversation that allows us to actually be in deep reflection about what we were doing before, before this moment. And to be in praise and celebration of much of the work that's gotten us where we need to be, but also in reflection of where we need to go, right? In this moment and beyond. And so Thenmozhi, Gail, and Anna, I'm actually gonna bring you all into the next question, which I'd like for you to actually think about this more, not just what the challenges that we're seeing abroad, right, and transnationally and globally through an intersectional lens or through a feminist lens, but also what are the lessons, right, that we can learn from the leadership of international and transnational feminists. If you can all just share, you know, what are the lessons as we come kind of close to a close, what are the lessons that we can actually garner from our intersectional and transnational feminists abroad? Thenmozhi, Gail, and Anna, in that order.
Well, I think for me, one of the things that I'm so struck by, especially with the challenges that we're facing in India, is that you have to keep in mind for India, you know, before COVID hit, India was in a genocidal state. And, you know, they had just passed this law called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which basically would render hundreds of millions of people not citizens and create the largest statelessness crisis in world history. And that's what people were struggling with beforehand. And so there was a pogrom, and then and the pogrom that happened, which happened in late February, happened when Donald Trump was in the city of the pogrom. And so while that motherfucker was not planning for COVID, he was actually working with another authoritarian figure to gaslight Indian Muslims and to help pave the way for genocide. And what we're seeing now is, despite there being like a lot of press like that are saying that Modi's a strong guy and he's been doing all these good things, the reality is that the brunt of the COVID failure is being held by the caste oppressed, the poor, and women, and gender non-conforming and trans people. And we've seen people who, a lockdown there like basically went into effect in 24 hours, and all of a sudden like millions of people had no way home, had no money, and had no food, and they were expected to get home in distances of 300 to 400 to even 600 miles. And migrants who had no money basically just walked with like hungry bellies and no potential for what was going to happen when they got home. And when they got home, you saw some villages where they sprayed migrants with bleach, and other villages where they caged them up into a quote unquote quarantine. And I want to go back to, something that Anna said, which is that, some lives are essential and some lives are not. And I think that in this moment, what I've seen is in the direness of this violence, we have seen feminist responses all across South Asia meet this moment with dignity, with compassion, with grace, and an idea that solidarity is not transactional, but is one rooted in co-liberation. And so, if someone has like, a kilogram of rice, which is like about 2 pounds of rice, half of that rice stays with you and another half goes to your neighbor. And I think it's in these ways, like, from, the sharing of rice that you have, to the sharing of our stimulus check, to the kinds of risks we're willing to take right now so that no one person is carrying an undue level of risk. I think all of that comes from a feminist practice that is a counter to this violent patriarchal system. And, I just think about how precious, I was to my mom in growing up, and the way that she would like look at my hands and press oil into my body, because despite the fact that she couldn't guarantee the future that I would have, despite the violence that most Dalit people face, she was going to love and nurture me as her child into a future that she may not have experienced. And in many ways, I think that's what so many of the feminists on this call and the feminists in our movements is that we are having to make incredibly difficult decisions, but not ones where we're willing to dispose of any one living person that we love and care about. And that in many ways, our understanding of survival at this moment is moving away from a capitalist individual understanding of the survival of the me to the survival of the we and the species self. And I think when we start to put our priorities to the survivor of our species from a feminist frame, we can start to rethink about so much of our transactions in the world to things that we want to consent to, the ways that we want to exist with the earth, with each other, and, and across these regions that don't have to be divided by violent borders, whether it's by caste or by race or nationality or language. And so I'm struck by the fact that we don't have the answers that we need, but we have the practices that we require for us to be able to find the path forward. And it's that engine of hope, and it's that engine of possibility, particularly when we're grounded by our ancestral lineages. I feel like in that route, we'll be able to find that future that allows us to create the maximum path for people to find their way out of this pandemic.
Hi, did I drop out? Sorry. Yeah, okay, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I'd really like to echo and start from that point about finding our ancestral roots as the starting point for us to go forward. because it seems really, really fundamental. And it seems actually to be what we ground in our practice wherever we're located. Actually, we are guided by that in multiple ways. But I'd also like to say two further things. One is the absolute importance about having a form of feminism, which I think a Black feminism or a woman of color feminism is, that does attend to the complexities of gender. We know as Black and women of color, cis, trans, intersex, we know that gender isn't a simple thing, and that it does require progressive, different kinds of masculinity, but different kinds of femininity too. Absolutely, not ones that are just reproduce the kind of normativities and we feel satisfied in those. But I think as well, in what COVID it shows us is the ways in which the gendered dimensions of COVID as the disease and critical illness and the deaths do collapse gender, because Black men and Black women together are more susceptible to it. For all the reasons that about access to services, but also because of the embodied memory of earlier forms of disposability and abuse and violence. Mm-hmm. Our bodies know it in the kinds of illnesses that we carry with us as a population. They're inscriptions of those earlier forms of white supremacy. So I think that that's really important to hold on to that, and that helps us to see when moments when gender collapses, and also when we need to think about gender in much more complex ways. But the other thing I think is really important for us to think about is what this virus reveals, and it is a virus that reveals, as everything that we've been talking about shows, it reveals all the ways in which the multiple forms of violence and aggression against us as Black and brown people and as Black and brown women. And in the kind of structure of racial gendered capitalism, there are two prongs. There's tracking and disposability. The disposability we've talked about, but there's tracking too. And in this country, at least, tracking is really to the fore. There's tracking, obviously, that's ascended to all the criminal justice system, the way in which people are tracked all the time. But there's tracking in the way that Amazon tracks us in terms of all those issues about tracking us for consumption and to keep business going and all that. But there's tracking now in terms of COVID, in terms of track and trace. Yeah. That's what it's called. The next response is going to be that we've all got to download an app onto our phones so that can then Bluetooth in connection with all those other phones that we walk by, and then they'll be able to track not only whether we've got the virus, but also where we've been and who's been in some kind of connection with us. Now imagine what that means in terms of a state of surveillance and everything. So alongside surveillance disposability being central to racial gendered capitalism, so is tracking and surveillance. And yet inside all of that, and we see this in the British context, we see it particularly in relation to the work that feminists are doing, Black feminists, women of color feminists are doing in relation to forms of domestic violence and intimate terrorism, is the ways in which we kind of get underneath those structures, those twin structures, and find ways to live differently, to practice a different kind of politic that addresses those questions of violence, but also anticipates what might be needed next. So a practical example here is the ways in which, as people have already been saying, that the incidence of known, stated, recorded forms of domestic violence have spiked hugely. In this country, 2 women a week are recorded as being killed by an intimate partner.
That's right.
In the last 3 weeks, 14 women and 2 children were killed. So the spike has been massive. But at the same time, what we're finding is that women can't get out. The lockdown means that they're locked in with the violators in that way. But what some of the work that's happening is that women, like Women and Girls Network, are organizing in ways to anticipate what those women will need, those women and children will need the moment lockdown happens and they can get out. So preparing what they will need, both in terms of food and cash, but also for emotional support and forms of escape. And it's that kind of anticipatory work that kind of happens beneath these twin pillars of tracking and disposability that seems to be a model of the forms of feminist activism and practice and revolutionary love that we've all been talking about and which we know are exemplary of the kinds of feminist practice that we want to promote and will save us.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all so much. And as we're coming just to the close, I want to just do a round of final thoughts from each of you about what some of the radical work and practice you've led on the ground has looked like. What are the demonstrations we should be looking to, you know, the feminist practices? What are communities and villages of feminists doing in response, right, to the crisis that's happening right now? And where should we be looking, right? And so folks who are listening and tuning in, or even if you're jumping off now, to stay updated, please text majority to 90975, #Rising Majority, and visit the risingmajority.org to stay up to date on all of the work, the coalition building, the movement building, the organizational work that's moving at the ground level and through community. But I just want to hear one last round from each of you. If you could just take 30 seconds to just say, where should we be looking? What's the mandate that you're lifting up right now in the midst of this crisis? And how are your communities responding with radical work? We'll start with Rose, please.
Word, thank you. Peace, y'all, and thank you for spending this last hour with us. I think quickly, so many thoughts to share, but I just want to lift up the work of Black LGBTQIA+ Migrant Project, my political home. We are leading the first ever national research project on the lives of and experiences of Black, trans, queer, and non-binary migrant and first generation folks. And so definitely check out blmp.org for more information about that, as well as our work to close detention facilities across the country and to support Black, queer, trans, and non-binary folks who are detained. Yeah, blmp.org.
Thank you so much. Anna?
Thank you. I want to really lift up one of the most important lessons that I think is coming out of this global pandemic is that our current economic system really exacerbates how it affects various peoples, and that is capitalism. And it's no coincidence that the epicenter of the pandemic are in the so-called developed world. We've got New York within the United States is in the epicenter of the epicenter, and London is the epicenter in Europe. And these are the sort of ground zero of capitalism. And the capitalist response to the pandemic is exacerbating the situation. But where we see communities actually surviving and caring for folks and having very low death rates, those are communities practicing feminist economy or principles of feminist economy. And those are part of our mandates. Principles of a feminist economy would include ensuring healthcare for all and ensuring socialized reproductive labor so that we share the reproductive labor that goes into cultivating and taking care of a community across genders, across race, and center that in our economy, understanding that the care labor is actually what's essential for the survival of humanity, not paid labor or labor associated with production of goods or profit. That is not essential to our survivability as a species on this planet, but care, labor, and reproductive labor is essential for our ability to survive. And examples of mutual aid projects, those are examples of mini little feminist economies, whether they use that terminology or not, but bringing masks and gloves and food to folks who aren't able to leave their homes, that is an example of care and shared care labor. And so mandates or demands that we want to lift up are part of the people's bailout. And these are very economic demands that are part of a feminist economy.
Thank you so much. We'd love to turn it to M.
Thank you. I think right now we have the opportunity to take a close look, an examination of gender-based violence, not just as singular incidents, but as a social consequence of this pandemic, but also as a social consequence of gendered racial capitalism. So we have an opportunity, I think, to redefine who we are to one another and therefore redefine gender. Yeah. And that's what I think is possible in this time and in this moment. And that's what I think we have the power to do inside of our communities. So I think some organizations that we can pay attention to, of course, Freedom Inc. I think every day we're spending our time with Black, Hmong, Cambodian women, queer, trans, intersex folks and girls, and trying to figure out how we move into our autonomy and build power within our communities to ultimately uproot these systems of violence, focusing on gender-based violence, domestic violence, sexual violence, but also disrupting systems and systemic violence. Yeah. Another thing that I want to point to in terms of what we should be demanding and looking for at this time is the work of the Movement for Black Lives. We recently worked with several organizations to develop a policy platform that speaks to what the needs of Black folks are in this time, to both pull us through the pandemic, but also change what's happening altogether to make it so that we are not vulnerable for another pandemic. And you can check that out at mforbl.org, mforbl.org. Love and power, y'all.
Thank you so much, Em. Gail.
Yeah, I'd like to big up the work that queer and LGBT communities are doing here in a practical way. One is to literally to get food and resources to queer, trans, LGBT people who are really suffering as a result of this pandemic, partly because of employment. Many of them are working in jobs where they're self-employed. The jobs have gone, they're suffering. They can't pay the rent, they can't put food on the table. And there's lots of mobilization to support those. And in the process, putting on the table again exactly what we've been talking about, a transformed understanding of what gender is and the ways in which we get away from all these binary categories that are just more forms of microviolence after all. But I'd also like to big up to the work of Galdem. So you all talk about, you know, a socialized kind of healthcare. Well, we had that. Okay, we had that. But the trouble is, as good as it was, and it's been really destroyed by these recent governments and stuff, but as good as it was premised on racialized labor as producing it as part of the kind of social reproduction, but not the same entitlements. And what's been revealed by this COVID virus and the disproportionate impacts on us is that no longer will we allow that to happen. And so, led by people, organizations like Galdem, they're moving and saying, yes, we want to come back to our National Health Service in the way that it's healthcare for all, but not with its racialized and gendered disadvantages built into it. So that I want to big that up too, because we need to retrieve it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Gail. Raquel and Thenmozhi to close us out.
Yeah, I want to thank everyone for being on this, in this conversation with us, and folks who are listening, you're in this conversation too, because it's ongoing. Yes. And I echo a lot of what has been said. I think we have to continue to push the boundaries and the binaries, as Rose put so perfectly earlier, that are kind of set up around us. So that also means, I think for me, trying to focus a lot more on how to get people to understand that trans and cis are not binaries, that we're all inherently gender nonconforming, because we will never live up to these ideals of a white capitalist bourgeois masculinity or femininity, right? So we're in the thick of this together. And then as far as the work, I always have to lift up Black Trans Circles, a project of Transgender Law Center that is focused on using political education and storytelling for healing justice, particularly for Black trans women in the southern United States. And then I also want to lift up, I mean, there's so many organizations and initiatives led by trans folks. I'm sure wherever you live, if you do a little digging, you can find them. Ones close to my heart are Solutions Not Punishments Collaborative in Atlanta, Georgia. They are working on a project where they are creating survival sex work kits for sex workers in the area, particularly Black trans women. Shout out to the Transgender Cultural District, the first ever in the world that's in San Francisco. They need all the support as well as they continue to lead a really revolutionary cultural project that has never existed before. And then here in Brooklyn and New York, there are projects like the Okra Project, which is a Black trans-led project that is focused on alleviating the issues of food insecurity for Black trans folks in the New York, New Jersey, and also Philadelphia area. And then the last thing I'll say, there's so many, is For the Girls, that's GWORLS, which is a fund that was shifted from these parties raising funds for people to now that, you know, they're taking funds digitally to raise money for trans and gender nonconforming folks who need support with particularly affirming healthcare. So all of those different things, look them up. I also wrote an article for Zora about how trans communities are continuing to be resilient, and there's a list of resources there as well.
Thank you so much. Thenmozhi to close us, and then we'll say goodnight, but please do share final thoughts and anything you want to lift up in this moment.
Sure. Well, I just want to thank everyone who is part of this conversation. I didn't realize how much I needed to be part of community tonight. And, you know, I know it's really funny because like when we're on these Zoom calls, we're supposed to be professional, but it was a really hard day, you know, and I think all of us are carrying the grief of so many people around us, and to feel the power of this moment is really why we do movement building in the time of these crises. And you know, so I want to thank everybody here. Like, I felt your love, and you know, I needed it, and I really appreciate all y'all for being here. But that said, I also just want to point you guys to, you know, our work at Equality Labs, and that in many ways, like what our focus is really at this time is to really lift up the voices of caste oppressed and religious minority South Asian communities, both in the United States and in South Asia, because it is still a genocidal moment. And, you know, and so if you follow us on Facebook and on Twitter and on Instagram, you'll hear rapid response calls for action. Right now, there are Muslim political prisoners that have been put into jail, including a pregnant student who is 4 months pregnant, being targeted by the state. And we also have, you know, again, all of these outstanding cases for mutual aid. And so you'll see those calls from our website, but also we, you know, a campaign that we're about to launch that, you know, may have touch points with everyone here is just like we're all sheltering in place, so are all of the white nationalists. And we are seeing a huge uptick of targeting of women of color online. And so part of our goal over the next couple of months is we have a rapid response channel. So if your organization or as an individual get targeted, please reach out to us. You can find us on our website at equalitylabs.org. And we'll be releasing some reports about Islamophobic hate speech that we're seeing in the rise of COVID, so that we can not just document the harm, but also build power. Because we are the canaries in the coal mine, but we are also the pathway to the future that we want. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you all. I mean, so much for just an incredible hour and 15 minutes, and the patience of, you know, our comrades who are viewing and being with us. I want to thank the Rising Majority, the comrades there who made this teach-in possible. Every speaker, the presenters, the panelists, you all were incredible tonight, and continue to remind me, you know, why I'm in this work and how we're actually going to see through.
Yes.
So
Yes.
thanks, Gail, Thenmozhi, Raquel, Anna, Rose, really each of you and all who listened in and participated. Again, please be sure to go to therisingmajority.com and sign up, right, for updates about our next teach-in. You can do that now, and national convenings and regional gatherings that we'll be holding virtually and in person when we're able to gather together again. If you're a leader of an organization that would like to learn more about the work of the Rising Majority, sign up to attend an info session or an orientation. Under events, check out the great work of partner organizations, many of whom are on this call right now, and a number of others who are continuing to do feminist work and work across the globe. That includes mutual aid projects and many of the projects and efforts that were lifted up. Now more than ever, we get to be in coalition with each other to deepen our collective strategy and our shared practice, and looking at all of these intersections, right, across our work, and continuing to fight for community and be in community together. We are our best hope for each other in these times and in this moment, for our survival, for our future, for the survival of this planet that we're on and occupying. And we're also descendants of people who've survived, right, despite all odds. And we hold that wisdom deeply and truthfully. So continue to fight with us. Text majority to 90975. Follow this conversation. Find the recording of this conversation at #RisingMajority, the Rising Majority. Continue to be well and safe and healthy, and stay in touch and connected with us. Thank you all again. Thank you so much. Have a great night.
Thank you.
That's Jay.
Thank you.